You are listening to Crazy Karen HOA. She tried to fine me for weather. The ruler slapped down on the snowbank beside my front steps, and Susan's voice cut through the freezing morning air like a knife. You are 3 inches over the allowable accumulation threshold, she said, her breath fogging as she leaned in. That is a violation. I stood there in my navy winter jacket and green knit cap, my hands shoved in my pockets against the cold, staring at the plastic ruler sticking up out of the snow like a tiny gravestone. A de-icer sprayer bottle sat on my porch railing where I had left it the night before, and Susan's eyes locked onto it like she had found nuclear material. That is a chemical hazard, she said. Unregulated storage of hazardous substances in a common view area. I will be filing a formal complaint with the board today, and you can expect a fine schedule by end of business. I checked my watch because I had a deadline at work and I could not afford to be late, not after the move, not after everything I had already paid to get settled in this place. My name is not important, but my job is. I am a financial analyst and I track every HOA fee, every assessment, every late charge that Rosewood Winter Walk Commons Association tries to slip past the homeowners in Boston, Massachusetts. I moved here 3 months ago because I needed a reset after a rough year, and I thought a managed community would mean less hassle. I was wrong. This neighborhood is the kind of place where gray areas equal HOA power grabs, and Susan, the records custodian, had turned document access into a weapon. She stalled requests, overcharged for copies, and used her position to bury anything that made the board look bad. I had already paid over $2,000 in fees I could not verify, because she refused to provide the backup unless I paid her another $50 per document. The stakes were simple. I was rebuilding after a move and I could not take more disruption, not financially, not emotionally, not logistically. My mailbox access mattered because I was waiting on critical documents, tax paperwork and contract approvals that could not be delayed. Susan pulled out a laminated policy sheet and held it between us like a shield, her finger jabbing at a paragraph I could not read from where I stood. Section 12.4, she said. Any chemical storage visible from common areas must be approved in writing by the Architectural Review Committee. You did not apply. That is an automatic $500 fine, and if it is not removed within 24 hours, it goes up to $1,000. I glanced at the bottle. It was store-bought sidewalk de-icer. The kind you can get at any hardware store. I said, "That is de-icer. It is for the steps." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "Your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead," she said. I wanted to argue, but my watch buzzed with a reminder about a morning meeting. I said I would handle it and turned to leave, but she called after me. "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule," she said. I heard the same line 2 days later when I tried to ask why my mailbox key had stopped working. The first notice arrived that afternoon, printed on Rosewood Winter Walk Commons Association letterhead with my address misspelled, and a violation date that was 4 days in the future. I stood in my kitchen reading it, the paper cold in my hands because the heat in this place barely worked, and the HOA had told me that thermostat complaints were not emergencies. The notice claimed I had failed to remove snow accumulation in excess of allowable limits, and that I was storing hazardous materials in violation of community standards. The fine total was $750, due within 10 days, with a hearing date circled in red pen. I took a photo of the notice and checked my phone calendar. The violation date listed had not happened yet. I had documentation of every single snowstorm, every time I shoveled, every invoice from the plow service I had hired after the first blizzard. This was fabricated, and I knew it, but proving it was going to be another story. I called the management company that afternoon and got a voicemail. I called again the next morning and got transferred 3 times before someone told me that violation disputes had to go through the records custodian, which meant I had to go through Susan, the same person who had written the complaint. I asked if there was an appeal process, and the woman on the phone said I could request the meeting minutes, but those cost $15 per page and took 2 weeks to process unless I paid a rush fee. I hung up and checked my watch again. My next deadline was in 4 hours, and I had 3 reports to file before market close. I could not afford to spend my day fighting a fake notice, but I also could not afford to let this slide. The escalation started 2 days later. I came home from work to find Susan standing on the sidewalk in front of my unit with a tape measure, a clipboard, and a small folding table she had set up like she was running a crime scene investigation. She had the plastic ruler again, and this time she was measuring the width of the cleared path on my section of the shared walkway. A surprise sidewalk measuring stunt where Susan showed up with a ruler like it was a crime scene, complete with a neighbor she had convinced to stand there as a witness. The neighbor looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot in his boots, but he did not leave. Susan saw me and straightened up, her pink belted wool coat bright against the gray sky. "I am documenting non-compliance," she said. "Your cleared path is 14 inches. The regulation minimum is 18 inches. I will be adding this to your file." I asked who set that regulation, and she tapped the clipboard. "The board," she said. "Last month." I said I had not received any notice of a new regulation, and she smiled that same cold smile. "Ignorance is not a defense," she said. "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." I went inside and sent an email to the management company asking for a copy of the new sidewalk regulation and the meeting minutes from last month. I got an auto reply telling me to contact the records custodian. I sent the email to Susan directly, and she replied within 10 minutes. Document request received. Processing fee is $15 per page. Estimated page count is 42 pages. Please remit payment via check or money order within 5 business days to proceed. I did the math. $630 for meeting minutes. I opened my banking app and checked my balance. I had the money, barely, but paying it meant pushing other things back. I was waiting on a reimbursement check from my last apartment complex, and it was supposed to come to my mailbox here, but my mailbox key still did not work and the HOA had not responded to my maintenance request. The second escalation hit me 4 days later, and it was worse. I came home to find a contractor truck parked in front of my unit, and 2 men in high visibility vests were standing on my front steps with a bag of rock salt and a spreader. One of them looked up when I pulled in and waved me over. "We are here to treat your steps," he said. "HOA sent us. Safety compliance." I asked who authorized it, and he pulled out a work order on his phone. It had Susan's name on it and a note that said the treatment was mandatory under the winter safety protocol and that the cost would be billed to my account. I said I had already treated my steps, and he shrugged. "We got the order, man. We gotta do the work, or we do not get paid." A vendor sent to alter something on my property without permission under the excuse of safety, and the bill was $450. I told them to stop and said I was calling the management company. They looked at each other, and one of them said they had 3 more stops and could not wait around. I stood in front of the steps and said they were not touching my property without written authorization from me. The guy with the phone made a call, and I heard him say the homeowner was refusing service. A minute later, Susan's voice came through the speaker, tinny and sharp. "This is a safety issue," she said. If you refuse compliance, the board will pursue emergency remediation and add the costs to your account with penalties. You will also be reported for obstruction. I said I wanted to see the regulation that allowed them to enter my property, and she said it was in the bylaws. I said I wanted the page number, and she hung up. The contractors left, but one of them handed me a copy of the work order. It had today's date, but the authorization signature was dated 3 days ago. I took a photo and sent it to my phone. If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, please hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the next story, where karma comes for the board. That night, I started building my case. I had been tracking every interaction with Susan since the first week I moved in, not because I expected a war, but because I am a financial analyst and I track everything. I pulled up my files and started organizing. I had copies of every notice, every email, every fee invoice, every request for documents, every denial. I had photos of the de-icer bottle, the snow depth on my steps, the cleared walkway, the contractor work order, the backdated authorization. I also had something Susan did not know about. Tow dispatch logs and call recordings showing Susan authorized a tow without proper authority. 3 weeks ago, my car had been towed from my assigned spot while I was at work. The tow company told me it was an HOA request, and when I called Susan, she said I had parked in a reserved spot during a snow emergency. I paid the $215 release fee because I needed my car. But I also filed a records request with the tow company under consumer protection laws. They sent me the dispatch log, the call recording, and the authorization form. The call recording had Susan's voice, clear as day, saying the car was abandoned and blocking snow removal equipment. The dispatch log showed the call came in at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, hours before any snow emergency was declared, and the authorization form had a signature that did not match any board member I could find on the HOA website. I opened a new folder and labeled it Evidence. I saved everything there, backed it up to the cloud, and printed a hard copy. I also reached out to an ally. The neighborhood security guard supervisor, a guy named Marcus, had been on shift the night my car got towed. He had told me at the time that he thought something was off because he had not seen any snow emergency notices, and my car was in my assigned spot. I called him and asked if he remembered that night. He said he did, and he also said he was tired of Susan's demands. She had tried to get him fired twice because he would not enforce rules that did not exist, and she had filed complaints with his company claiming he was not responding fast enough to her calls. I asked if he would be willing to go on record, and he said yes. He also said he had saved the shift logs from that night and could provide them if I needed them. I thanked him and added his name to my file. The side complication came the next morning. I woke up to the sound of scraping outside and looked out my window to see a man in a Rosewood Winter Walk Commons Association jacket spreading salt on my front steps. The HOA tried to salt my steps without permission so they could claim I did it wrong, and I knew exactly what was happening. I grabbed my phone, pulled on my jacket and cap, and went outside. The man looked up and said he was doing routine safety treatment. I said I did not request it, and I did not authorize anyone to enter my property. He said it was a common area, and I said the steps leading to my front door were not a common area. They were part of my unit. He pulled out his phone and made a call. A minute later, he handed me the phone. It was Susan. "This is a safety issue," she said. "The board has determined that your steps pose a slip hazard due to inadequate treatment, and we are exercising our emergency remediation authority." I said she needed my written consent, and she said emergency remediation did not require consent. I asked where that was written, and she said it was in the bylaws. I said I wanted the section number, and she hung up. I took photos of the man, his truck, the salt spreader, and the steps before he touched them. Then I told him if he put 1 grain of salt on my property, I would file a police report for trespassing. He looked at me, looked at the phone, and then got back in his truck and left. I went inside and checked my watch. I had 15 minutes before my first meeting, and I had already spent half an hour fighting off an HOA ambush. The hearing notice arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered by Susan herself. She knocked on my door at 7 in the morning, and when I opened it, she was standing there with the plastic ruler in one hand and an envelope in the other. "Formal hearing," she said. "Tomorrow night, 6 p.m., Community Center. You are required to attend or the board will proceed with enforcement in your absence." She held out the envelope, and when I took it, she blew the whistle hanging around her neck, a sharp blast that made my ears ring. "That is for non-compliance documentation," she said. I needed a timestamp. She turned and walked away, and I stood there holding the envelope, my breath fogging in the cold. Inside the envelope was a hearing notice with a violation summary that was 3 pages long. It listed every alleged infraction: chemical hazard storage, snow accumulation excess, sidewalk clearance deficiency, refusal of emergency safety services, obstruction of HOA contractors, unauthorized alteration of common areas. The fine total was now $4,200, and the notice said that if I did not pay or appear, the board would place a lien on my property and pursue legal action. I read it twice, then took photos and added them to my evidence folder. I also noticed something. The violation dates were still wrong. 2 of them were listed as occurring on dates I had been out of state for work, and I had travel receipts and hotel invoices to prove it. Someone was making this up as they went, and they were not even being careful about it. I called Marcus and told him about the hearing. He said he would try to attend, but he was on shift that night and could not make promises. I asked if he could send me the shift logs from the town night, and he said he would email them within the hour. I also called a lawyer, a guy I had worked with on a contract dispute at my last job. He listened to the summary and said it sounded like harassment and possible fraud, but he could not take the case without a retainer, and his rate was $350 an hour. I did not have that kind of money to spend up front, so I thanked him and said I would keep him posted. He told me to document everything and to record the hearing if it was legal in Massachusetts. I checked. Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state, but HOA meetings are considered public if they involve enforcement actions, so I could record as long as I announced it at the start. The twist hit me the night before the hearing. I was reviewing the meeting minutes I had finally received after paying Susan's extortion fee, and I noticed something wrong. The minutes from the January meeting listed a vote on new snow removal regulations, and the vote was recorded as passing unanimously. But I had checked the board roster, and 2 of the board members listed as present had resigned in December. I pulled up the HOA website and confirmed it. The minutes were edited after the meeting, and the original file was recovered when I looked at the metadata on the PDF. The file properties showed it had been created 2 weeks after the meeting date, and the author was listed as Susan Davis. I took screenshots and added them to the evidence folder. This was not just harassment. This was fraud. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I printed copies of everything: the tow dispatch logs, the call recordings, the contractor work orders, the backdated notices, the fraudulent meeting minutes. The shift logs from Marcus showing no snow emergency had been declared. The travel receipts proving I was out of state on 2 of the alleged violation dates. I also prepared a statement, short and direct, laying out the timeline and the evidence. I practiced reading it aloud, timing it to stay under 5 minutes. Then I packed everything into a folder, set 3 alarms, and tried to sleep. The hearing was held in the community center, a low brick building at the edge of the neighborhood with a parking lot that had not been plowed in days. I arrived 15 minutes early and found a spot near the entrance, my car crunching through frozen slush. Inside, the room was set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front for the board and rows of folding chairs for homeowners. Susan was already there, sitting at a side table with a laptop and a stack of binders. She saw me and smiled, tapping the plastic ruler on the table like a gavel. The board members filtered in one by one. President, vice president, treasurer, secretary, all of them looking tired and annoyed. The president, a man in his 60s with a gray beard, called the meeting to order at 6 sharp and asked if anyone had announcements. I raised my hand and said I was recording the meeting for my records. He frowned but nodded and said it was noted. Susan stood up and gave her report. She described me as a problem homeowner who had repeatedly violated community standards, refused compliance, obstructed contractors, and created safety hazards. She pulled up photos on a projector, showing the de-icer bottle, the snow on my steps, the narrow cleared walkway. She read from the violation summary, her voice clipped and official. When she finished, the president asked if I had anything to say. I stood up, pulled out my folder, and said I had evidence that the violations were fabricated. Susan's smile disappeared. I started with the meeting minutes. I explained that the January minutes listed board members who had resigned in December and that the file metadata showed the document was created weeks after the meeting. I passed copies to the board, and I watched the president's face change as he read. I moved on to the tow dispatch logs, explaining that Susan had authorized a tow without proper authority and that the call recording proved there was no snow emergency at the time. I played a 10-second clip of Susan's voice saying the car was abandoned, and the room went silent. Then I pulled out the contractor work orders, showing the backdated authorization signature, and the travel receipts proving I was out of state on 2 of the violation dates. I finished with the shift logs from Marcus, showing no snow emergency had been declared the night my car was towed. The president looked at Susan. He asked if she had a response. She stood up, and for the first time she did not look confident. She said the minutes were a clerical error, that the tow was a miscommunication, that the contractor work orders were standard procedure. She said I was twisting everything to avoid accountability. The president asked if she had documentation to support her claims. She said it was all in the files, but she would need time to pull it together. He said the hearing was being tabled pending a full review of the records. Susan's face went red. She blew the whistle hanging from her neck, a sharp blast that made everyone wince. "That is not how this works," she said. "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." The president told her to sit down. I nodded like I was losing, because I wanted her to get comfortable. But I was not done yet. I had one more thing, and I had been holding it back because I needed the right moment. A management company internal note admitting the violation was fabricated. I had gotten it 2 days ago from a contact at the management company, someone who had been copied on an email chain and was tired of covering for Susan. The note was short, just 3 sentences, but it was damning. It said the snow accumulation violation was initiated without a site visit, that the chemical hazard claim was not supported by any inspection, and that the file should be closed with no penalty. I pulled out the note and handed it to the president. Then I said I was submitting the full evidence packet to the HOA attorney and that I expected a formal retraction and refund of all fees within 10 business days. The room erupted. Homeowners started shouting questions. Someone asked if Susan had been falsifying records for other violations. Someone else asked if the board had known. The president banged his hand on the table and said the meeting was adjourned pending legal review. Susan stood up, grabbed her binders, and walked out, her pink coat flaring behind her. I stayed in my seat, watching her go, and I felt my hands shaking. It was not over yet, but I had just landed the first real hit. The funny karma moment came 3 days later. I was checking my email when I saw a message from the HOA with the subject line "Correction and Clarification." I opened it, and it was from the president. He wrote that the board had completed a review of recent enforcement actions and found several procedural errors. Effective immediately, all violations issued by the records custodian over the past 6 months were being reviewed, and any homeowner who believed they had been incorrectly fined could request a refund. He also wrote that the board was implementing a policy clarification that destroyed Susan's favorite tactic. All future violation notices would require a site visit by a licensed inspector, photographic documentation, and board approval before any fines were issued. Backdated notices were explicitly banned, and any violation with a future date would be automatically void. But the best part came at the end. The email said that due to procedural concerns, Susan Davis was being removed as meeting chair and would lose microphone control during board proceedings. All document requests would now be handled by the management company directly, with a standard fee schedule posted on the website. I read the email twice, then leaned back in my chair and laughed until my stomach hurt. The final showdown came during the next blizzard, 2 weeks later. I was leaving for work early, trying to get ahead of the storm, when I saw Susan standing at the snowed-in curb cut by the school bus stop where she tried to claim it was my responsibility. She had her plastic ruler, her whistle, and the laminated policy sheet, and she was blocking my car. "You are not leaving until we settle this," she said. I rolled down my window and asked what she wanted. She said I owed the HOA for emergency snow removal services, that the curb cut was part of my assigned maintenance area, and that I had failed to clear it before the storm. I said the curb cut was a common area, not my responsibility, and she said it was listed in my deed. I asked for the page number, and she said she did not have it with her. I said I was leaving for work, and she needed to move. She did not. The line of cars behind me started honking. A neighborhood entrance confrontation where Susan tried to stop me from leaving for work, and the line of cars behind me started yelling at her. Someone shouted at her to move. Someone else yelled that they had kids to drop off. Susan blew her whistle and shouted back that this was an enforcement action and they needed to wait. The honking got louder. I checked my watch. I had 10 minutes before my meeting started, and I was not going to make it if this kept up. I put the car in park, got out, and walked up to her. I said she was blocking traffic and creating a safety hazard, and if she did not move, I was calling the police. She smiled and said she would tell them I was the one refusing to comply. That was when I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. It was the HOA attorney's email, the one I had received that morning. The attorney had withdrawn from the case mid-crisis and put it in writing, and the board was panicking because they had to answer homeowners with no cover. The email said the HOA's legal position was indefensible, that the fabricated violations exposed the association to liability, and that the attorney was terminating the representation effective immediately. I had forwarded it to the management company, the board president, and 3 homeowners I knew were organizing a recall petition. Susan read the email, and her face went pale. She looked up at me, and I said, "Your paperwork is cute, mine has a letterhead." The cars behind me erupted in cheers. Susan stepped aside, and I got back in my car and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing there in the snow, her whistle silent, her ruler drooping in her hand. The outcome came fast after that. The HOA sent a correction email retracting the smear, apologizing for procedural errors, and announcing a full audit of all enforcement actions taken over the past year. My fines were refunded in full along with the tow fees, the document request fees, and the contractor charges. I received a check for $6,340 and a letter from the board saying they were implementing new oversight procedures and that Susan had been reassigned to a non-enforcement role. A week later, I heard from Marcus that Susan had resigned entirely. The board was also facing a recall petition signed by over 60% of the homeowners, and the management company had started renegotiating their contract with new transparency requirements. I kept the plastic ruler. Susan had left it behind in the snow that morning, and I found it later when I came home from work. I put it on my desk as a reminder that you do not have to let people bully you just because they have a title and a laminated sheet. You track everything, you build your case, and you wait for the right moment. Then, you deploy the evidence and watch the whole thing collapse. The doorbell video played at the next board meeting, the one I attended as a homeowner observer. Someone had requested a review of the January meeting minutes, and when the board pulled up the original recording, it showed Susan arriving at my door to deliver a violation notice on a day she later claimed she never came by. The timestamp was clear, and so was her face. The board president apologized publicly, and the room broke into applause. I did not say anything. I just sat there and watched as a policy clarification that destroyed Susan's favorite tactic went into effect. As Susan was removed as meeting chair and lost the microphone control, and as the HOA sent a correction email retracting the smear. 3 months later, the neighborhood looks different. The new board is still figuring things out, but they have posted the bylaws online, they have capped document fees at $5, and they have required that all enforcement actions include photographic evidence and a site visit. The snow has started to melt, and the streets are clearer than they have been all winter. My mailbox key works now, and my reimbursement check finally arrived. I have been tracking the HOA budget like I always do, and for the first time since I moved here, the numbers make sense. Marcus stopped by last week to say hello. He told me the security company had promoted him after the recall petition went through, and that he was working on a new contract with better pay and clearer enforcement boundaries. I thanked him for his help, and he said he was glad someone finally stood up to Susan. He also said that 3 other homeowners had come forward with evidence of fabricated violations, and that the board was processing refunds for all of them. The total was over $40,000. The HOA had been running a shakedown operation, and it had been going on for years. I still check my watch constantly because of deadlines, and I still track every fee the HOA charges, but I do not feel the same dread when I pull into the neighborhood anymore. I know the rules now, and I know how to fight back when someone tries to twist them. I also know that if you keep your evidence organized and you wait for the right moment, you can win against people who think they are untouchable. The plastic ruler is still on my desk. Sometimes I look at it and think about that morning in the snow, about Susan's face when she realized I had outplayed her, about the line of cars honking and cheering as I drove away. It is a good reminder that you do not need a whistle or a laminated sheet to have power. You just need to know your rights, document everything, and refuse to back down. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.